The year 1968 stands as a jagged scar across the timeline of American history, a period defined by assassinations, war, and a cultural fabric tearing at the seams. In the sweltering heat of August, the Democratic National Convention descended upon Chicago, Illinois, bringing with it a collision of ideologies that would ignite the streets. What unfolded was not just a political gathering, but a violent confrontation between the establishment and the counterculture, a chaotic spectacle that the Walker Report later described as a police riot. But the true drama was yet to come, waiting inside a federal courtroom, where justice would be tested against the theater of the absurd. This was not merely a legal proceeding, it was a battle for the soul of a divided nation. Imagine a courtroom where the defendants wore judicial robes to mock the judge, where a revolutionary leader was bound and gagged in front of the jury, and where the line between legal argument and political protest was completely erased. This was the trial of the Chicago 7. Originally, the Chicago 8, a spectacle that captivated and horrified the world. How did a group of activists with vastly different agendas end up facing conspiracy charges together in one of the most controversial trials in the history of the United States? The answer lies in a web of government paranoia, secret surveillance, and a desperate need to restore order to a society that felt like it was spinning out of control. To understand the trial, we must first return to the scene of the alleged crime, the parks and streets of Chicago during the convention. The air was thick with humidity and tension, as thousands of protesters gathered to voice their opposition to the Vietnam War. Mayor Richard Daley had turned his city into a fortress, deploying 12,000 police officers and 6,000 National Guard troops to maintain order. The atmosphere was electric with fear and anticipation. Among the crowds were the Yippies led by Abbie Hoffman and Jerry Rubin, who promised to levitate the Pentagon and nominate a pig for president. There were also serious anti-war organizers like Tom Hayden and Rennie Davis, who sought to mobilize a massive peaceful demonstration against the ongoing conflict in Southeast Asia. The clash was inevitable, and when it arrived, it was brutal. In Lincoln Park and Grant Park, police officers removed their badges and charged into the crowds wielding batons and firing tear gas canisters indiscriminately. Journalists, bystanders, and medics were beaten alongside the protesters in a frenzy of violence that was broadcast live on television screens across the country. The images of bloodied students chanting "the whole world is watching" seared themselves into the collective consciousness. While the convention inside the amphitheater nominated Hubert Humphrey, the streets outside resembled a war zone. The chaos left hundreds injured and created a political firestorm that demanded a scapegoat. In the aftermath of the convention, the Department of Justice under President Lyndon Johnson initially found no grounds to prosecute the protest leaders. However, the political winds shifted dramatically with the election of Richard Nixon, who ran on a platform of law and order. The new Attorney General, John Mitchell, was determined to make an example of the dissidents. He utilized a provision of the Civil Rights Act of 1968 known as the Rap-Brown Law, which made it a federal crime to cross state lines with the intent to incite a riot. A grand jury was convened, and indictments were handed down against 8 men who would become the faces of radical America. The 8 defendants were a motley crew representing different factions of the left-wing movement. There was Abbie Hoffman and Jerry Rubin, the theatrical leaders of the Youth International Party. There was David Dellinger, a pacifist and veteran of the nonviolent civil rights movement. Tom Hayden and Rennie Davis were the intellectual architects of the Students for a Democratic Society. John Froines and Lee Weiner were academics accused of teaching protesters how to make incendiary devices. Finally, there was Bobby Seale, the co-founder of the Black Panther Party, who had only been in Chicago for a brief time and had little connection to the others. This disparity in their backgrounds made the conspiracy charge seem all the more perplexing to legal observers. The stage was set in the Federal District Court in Chicago, presided over by Judge Julius Hoffman. Despite sharing a surname with defendant Abbie Hoffman, there was no relation and certainly no affection between them. Judge Hoffman was an elderly establishment figure, known for his strict adherence to decorum and his short temper. From the very first day of the trial in September 1969, it was clear that this would be no ordinary legal proceeding. The courtroom was packed with supporters, reporters, and federal marshals, creating a pressure cooker atmosphere. The defense team was led by William Kunstler and Leonard Weinglass, two attorneys who were as committed to the cause as their clients. The prosecution, led by Richard Schultz and Thomas Foran, sought to paint the defendants as dangerous revolutionaries who had conspired to destroy the Democratic National Convention and incite violence. They presented a narrative of calculated anarchy, using speeches and writings from the defendants as evidence of their intent. The government argued that the riots were not spontaneous outbursts of frustration, but the result of a sinister plot hatched by these 8 men. They relied heavily on undercover agents who had infiltrated the protest groups, posing as sympathizers to gather intelligence. These agents testified about incendiary rhetoric and plans to confront the police. However, the defense argued that the trial was purely political, a show trial designed to silence dissent. They contended that the violence in Chicago was instigated by the police and that the defendants were being persecuted for their beliefs rather than their actions. William Kunstler often clashed with Judge Hoffman, challenging his rulings and accusing him of bias. The tension between the bench and the defense table was palpable, with the judge frequently sustaining prosecution objections and denying defense motions. It became a war of attrition, with the judge seemingly determined to secure a conviction regardless of the legal nuances. The most volatile element in the courtroom was the presence of Bobby Seale. Seale insisted that he had been denied his right to counsel, as his lawyer Charles Gary was recovering from surgery and could not attend. Judge Hoffman refused to delay the trial or allow Seale to represent himself. Frustrated and angry, Seale repeatedly interrupted the proceedings, calling the judge a fascist and a racist. He demanded his constitutional rights and refused to be silenced by the court. The conflict escalated day by day, turning the trial into a symbol of the racial and political oppression that the Black Panthers were fighting against. The situation with Bobby Seale reached a horrific climax that shocked the nation. After days of outbursts, Judge Hoffman ordered the marshals to bind and gag Seale in the courtroom. For several days, the leader of the Black Panthers sat shackled to his chair, with a gag strapped across his mouth, struggling to breathe and communicate. The sight of a black man bound and gagged in a federal court of law was a visceral reminder of the history of slavery and oppression in the United States. It was a visual representation of the justice system, silencing a dissenting voice. The defense attorneys were outraged, and the spectacle drew condemnation from around the world. Eventually, the situation became untenable even for Judge Hoffman. He declared a mistrial for Bobby Seale and severed his case from the others, charging him with 16 counts of contempt of court. Seale was sentenced to 4 years in prison for his outbursts, although these charges would later be overturned. With Seale gone, the Chicago 8 became the Chicago 7, but the atmosphere in the courtroom did not improve. If anything, the remaining defendants felt emboldened to challenge the legitimacy of the court with even greater fervor. They saw the treatment of Seale as proof that the system was rigged against them. Abbie Hoffman and Jerry Rubin turned the trial into a piece of guerrilla theater. They understood that the courtroom was a stage, and they intended to use it to mock the authority of the state. On one memorable occasion, they arrived in court wearing judicial robes. When ordered to remove them, they threw the robes to the floor to reveal police uniforms underneath. They blew kisses to the jury, made jokes, and refused to show the deference expected of defendants. Their strategy was to expose the absurdity of the proceedings by acting absurdly themselves. They wanted to put the system on trial. The trial dragged on for months, becoming a daily soap opera for the American public. The defense called a parade of celebrity witnesses to testify about the character of the defendants and the nature of the protest movement. Poet Allen Ginsberg took the stand and chanted Om to calm the courtroom. Writer Norman Mailer and musician Judy Collins also testified, attempting to explain the cultural context of the counterculture. These witnesses frustrated the prosecutor and the judge, who struggled to maintain control over the sprawling, chaotic narrative. The trial was no longer just about a riot, it was about a clash of generations. Despite the antics, the legal stakes were incredibly high. Each defendant faced up to 10 years in prison and substantial fines. The prosecution methodically built its case, presenting hours of news footage and police testimony. They focused on the inflammatory language used by the defendants, arguing that words like revolution and pig were clear calls to violence. The government tried to prove that the defendants had crossed state lines with a specific agreement to cause havoc. The defense countered by analyzing the intent behind the words, arguing that rhetorical hyperbole was protected by the First Amendment. One of the key points of contention was the nature of the permits for the protests. The defense argued that the city of Chicago had deliberately denied permits for the demonstrations, forcing the protesters into a confrontation with the police. They claimed that Mayor Daley had no intention of allowing peaceful dissent and had set a trap for the activists. Former United States Attorney General Ramsey Clark was called by the defense to testify about the permit negotiations, but Judge Hoffman barred him from testifying in front of the jury, stating that his testimony was irrelevant. This ruling infuriated the defense and further convinced them that the judge was biased. As the trial neared its end, the tension in the courtroom reached a breaking point. Judge Hoffman began issuing contempt citations to the defendants and their lawyers for every perceived slight. William Kunstler was cited for contempt numerous times for arguing with the judge and persisting in his defense strategies. The judge seemed to take the defiance of the defendants personally, reacting with increasing hostility. The daily transcripts read like a script from a satirical play, with the judge and the defendants trading insults and accusations. The closing arguments were a study in contrasts. Prosecutor Thomas Foran described the defendants as evil men who wanted to destroy the American way of life. He appealed to the jury's fear of chaos and anarchy, portraying the Chicago Seven as a threat to the very fabric of society. William Kunstler, in his closing summation, made a passionate plea for freedom of speech and the right to dissent. He argued that history would judge the court harshly for its treatment of the defendants, and that the true crime was the war in Vietnam and the repression of those who opposed it. In February 1970, the case finally went to the jury. While the jury deliberated, Judge Hoffman took the opportunity to sentence the defendants and their lawyers for contempt of court. The sentences were unusually harsh, ranging from months to years in prison. William Kunstler was sentenced to 4 years and 13 days for his conduct during the trial. The defendants were given lengthy sentences for their outbursts and mockery. It was a final act of vengeance by the judge before the verdict on the main charges was even delivered. The jury deliberated for several days, struggling to reach a consensus. The complexity of the conspiracy charges and the chaotic nature of the evidence made their task difficult. Finally, they returned with a mixed verdict. All 7 defendants were acquitted of the conspiracy charge, which was a significant blow to the government's theory of a pre-planned plot. However, 5 of the defendants, David Dellinger, Rennie Davis, Tom Hayden, Abbie Hoffman, and Jerry Rubin, were found guilty of crossing state lines with intent to incite a riot. John Froines and Lee Weiner were acquitted of all charges. The verdict was a partial victory for both sides, but the sentences handed down by Judge Hoffman were severe. The 5 convicted men were each sentenced to 5 years in prison and fined $5,000. The judge also ordered them to pay the costs of the prosecution. The defendants used their sentencing hearing to make final political statements condemning the war and the judicial system. Abbie Hoffman famously told the judge that he had tried to bring the ideas of the Founding Fathers into the courtroom, but the judge had rejected them. The immediate aftermath of the trial was a wave of protests across the country. The convictions were seen by many as a direct attack on the anti-war movement and the counterculture. The image of the Chicago 7 became a rallying cry for young people who felt alienated by the government. The trial had succeeded in making the defendants martyrs for the cause, amplifying their message far beyond what they could have achieved on the streets of Chicago. The government's attempt to silence them had only given them a bigger megaphone. However, the legal battle was far from over. The defense team immediately filed appeals, citing numerous errors by Judge Hoffman. They argued that the judge's bias, his refusal to permit key defense witnesses, and his conduct toward the defense attorneys had deprived the defendants of a fair trial. The appeal process would take years, but the lawyers were confident that the convictions would not stand. The record of the trial was filled with instances of judicial misconduct that were difficult to ignore. In 1972, the United States Court of Appeals for the Seventh Circuit issued its ruling. In a stinging rebuke to Judge Hoffman and the prosecution, the court overturned all of the convictions. The appellate court found that the judge had been antagonistic toward the defense and had failed to screen the jury for bias regarding pretrial publicity. They also ruled that the judge had erred in refusing to allow Ramsey Clark to testify. The court noted that the demeanor of the judge and the prosecutors would require a reversal of the convictions, even if the evidence had been stronger. The contempt charges were also largely overturned or dismissed. While the appellate court upheld the validity of the contempt citations, in principle they ruled that the sentences were excessive and that the defendants and lawyers were entitled to a trial by a different judge on those charges. Eventually, the government decided not to retry the case. The Department of Justice realized that a second trial would only serve to reopen old wounds and provide another platform for the activists. The Chicago 7 were free men. The legacy of the Chicago 7 trial endures as a cautionary tale about the abuse of judicial power and the fragility of civil liberties in times of crisis. It highlighted the deep divisions in American society during the Vietnam War era and the lengths to which the government would go to suppress dissent. The trial remains a subject of study for law students and historians, illustrating the tension between order and liberty. It serves as a reminder that the courtroom can become a battleground where political conflicts are waged under the guise of criminal justice. For the defendants, the trial was a defining moment in their lives. Tom Hayden went on to become a prominent politician, serving in the California state legislature. Abbie Hoffman continued his activism until his death, remaining a symbol of the counterculture. Jerry Rubin eventually moved away from radical politics and became a businessman. Bobby Seale continued his work with the Black Panthers, focusing on community service programs. Each of them carried the weight of the trial with them, shaping their future paths. The Chicago 7 trial also changed the way the American public viewed the legal system. It exposed the potential for bias and unfairness within the courts, shattering the illusion of blind justice. The spectacle of the trial was broadcast into living rooms, forcing citizens to confront the reality of political repression. It sparked a national conversation about the limits of protest and the role of the government in regulating speech. The questions raised by the trial regarding the balance between national security and individual rights remain relevant today. Looking back, the trial appears as a microcosm of the 1960s, a concentration of all the hope, rage, and confusion of that turbulent decade. It was a collision of the old guard and the new generation played out in a theater of law. The Chicago Seven were not just defendants, they were symbols of a changing world. Their defiance in the face of authority resonated with a generation that was questioning everything. The trial proved that even in the face of overwhelming state power, the spirit of dissent could not be easily extinguished. Today, the site of the protests in Grant Park is peaceful, a stark contrast to the violence of 1968. But the echoes of that summer and the subsequent trial still linger. The Chicago 7 trial challenges us to consider how we treat those who dissent and how our legal system handles political conflict. It asks us to look closely at the line between maintaining order and suppressing freedom. As we navigate our own times of political polarization, the story of the Chicago 7 serves as a powerful reminder of the importance of vigilance in the defense of our constitutional rights.